Hello, everyone. So good to be with you today and talk about my favorite subject, the mindful Enneagram. I'm looking forward to spending some time with you today talking about how to use this tool called the Enneagram and to use it with the amazing treasure chest of ideas and practices that we have inherited from the Buddhist tradition, especially mindfulness. So, I'm Rob Creekmore. I'll just introduce myself a little bit. I've been teaching mindfulness, meditation, Vipassana for about a little over 20 years. And I've been teaching the Enneagram as well for about a little over 10 years. And been practicing mindfulness meditation for about 30 years. So, why am I interested in this notion of the mindful Enneagram? What does mindfulness have to do with the Enneagram? And what is mindfulness? What is the Enneagram? I'm going to start with sharing a little bit about that. So, when I talk about mindfulness, and you all might have your own definition, but for me, to put it very simply, let me put it this way. I was just leading a meditation a couple of days ago, and I often will start a meditation by saying, come into a posture, a way of sitting or standing if you need to stand, or lying down if you need to. But come into a posture where you're able to be relaxed and alert at the same time, and also kind. Kind to yourself, kind to the people you're meditating with if you're meditating with others. So relaxed, alert, and kind. I mean, that would be one way you could sum up what mindfulness practice is learning the art of being relaxed in your body, alert with your attention, with what you're paying attention to, and being very much in the present moment, noticing what's really happening right now, being alert, being actively paying attention. And there's a heartful quality to mindfulness. Um, we're cultivating being kind towards not only other people, but towards ourselves. Often we'll talk about self-compassion, that's what we're cultivating with mindfulness practice. So that's my simple, boiling it all down. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about kind of a deeper understanding of the process of mindfulness that the Buddha talked about in one of his key sermons called The Foundations of Mindfulness. But let's let that suffice for now. So what's the Enneagram? So I'm going to share with you the Enneagram diagram. Many of you might already be somewhat familiar, at least, with the Enneagram. The Enneagram, as you can see here, is an ancient, it may be a very ancient symbol. The first person that we know of, at least in the West, to have introduced this symbol that you see, this circle with the lines in it, is George Gurdjieff. He lived in the first half of the 20th century was when he was teaching. And this symbol, you'll notice, has basically three parts. It's a circle. And within the circle, you've got a triangle shown in blue. And you've got these other kind of strange inner lines that are kind of a gold color. So Enneagram, Ennea, comes from the Greek word for the number 9. So it's a 9-pointed symbol. And you'll see that the points are numbered, starting at 9 at the top and then going 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way around. So the Enneagram can be used for a number of different purposes and is used to do other things. Gurdjieff himself used the Enneagram as a way of mapping out what happens when there's a transformational process, either with a person or, you know, cooking food, transforming raw food into a meal, or, you know, any kind of process where there's a transformation that occurs. That's how he used it. But much more popular and well known today, and what I'm endlessly fascinated by, is the use of the Enneagram to map 9 key archetypal ways that human beings tend to unintentionally suffer. You know, 9 ways that dukkha appears. You know, if you're familiar with Buddhism, you might have heard of the Four Noble Truths, which are all about, you know, what we could call suffering, or actually I would call it unintentional suffering, optional suffering, the suffering that you can learn to become completely free of. The Buddha called that dukkha, suffering. So there's the Enneagram, this particular way of using the Enneagram that I'm talking about today, and a lot of people are familiar with, is a map, basically, of 9 ways that we fixate around our sort of being separate. In Buddhism, we have this notion of no self, that our essential nature, or Buddha nature, or awakened nature, is not separate. We're more like a wave on an ocean of consciousness. That's what we can awaken to. And Buddhists would say that's our true nature, that's our essential nature. So we learn to think of ourselves as separate. We all have separate, unique personalities, and obviously we have bodies that appear to be separate from one another, and they are, you know, to some extent. Although at the molecular level, you can't see any separation at all, right? But we learn from a very early age to think of ourselves as separate and isolated and vulnerable. And you know, we're learning to be that way when we're little children. We're learning to be able to be safe and to interact with the world around us as separate beings, as with a separate body and a separate brain and so forth, a separate heart. But that tends, you know, we need that. We need a personality. We need an ego structure. We need to be able to interact with the world. But it goes a little too far in Buddhist psychology, and I think modern psychology is increasingly agreeing that this feeling of separation and also relying heavily on our unconscious conditioning that we learn at an early age, that we need to some extent, tends to dominate after just a few years of our life. And we kind of forget that it's all kind of a creation of the mind and of our emotions and our mind, this sense of self and separated self. And that essentially is dukkha. You know, when it causes suffering, when we react to our environment rather than to respond in a healthy way. A lot of that's based on early childhood psychological conditioning. So that's one way of looking at dukkha. That's kind of the core way I look at it. And so the Enneagram is at its core. I mean, it's sometimes it's used as a way to sort of see what my psychological type is and what I'm good at, what I'm not so great at, and it can be useful in that way. But really, at its core, what it was really meant for, when in terms of a typology, is to help us see particular ways that we tend to suffer. 9 particular archetypal ways that we suffer, that we cling to this separate sense of self and personality. So the good news of Buddhism, of the Dharma, and of the Enneagram is the story doesn't have to end there. There's, as the Buddha said in the Four Noble Truths, there's the reality of suffering, and we can understand the nature of suffering. That's the second noble truth. And then, but there's the third noble truth is there's freedom, that we can be completely free of this unnecessary aspect of suffering, this feeling of separation that's basically creation of our minds that, we learn at a very young age. And we have deeper capacities. Our awakened Buddha nature or essential nature has some very wonderful attributes, capacities that really don't come online until we start to wake up to who we really are, to our Buddha nature. So the Enneagram and Buddhism both show us how. They show us what our situation is. It's a great sort of diagnostic tool, but it's also a wonderful map of how to become free of that. I often like to use, when I'm talking about the Enneagram, I like to use the analogy of being in a prison cell. It's like, or we're like in the dungeon, of this fabulous castle or mansion, it's got all these beautiful rooms that we could explore, Think of those as aspects of ourselves that we don't even know are available to us, because we're very conditioned to stay in one little room down in the basement that's kind of like a dungeon, and it's like a prison cell. It's got a lock, and we're locked in there. We don't even know we're in that prison. It's kind of maybe dark, and it's all we've known. It's like my poor cat, that we never let out of the house. He's a house cat, and God help him if he gets outside. He goes crazy. He doesn't know what to make of it, right? And he doesn't know anything other than this house that he lives in with us. It's a little like that. So there's basically, the Enneagram basically says there's 9 archetypes, 9 ways, 9 types of prison cells. We tend, for reasons no one really quite understands, whether it's genetic or something else, we tend to gravitate towards one of these 9, you could call them coping strategies that we learn at a very early age. What we think we need to do to survive. They're mental habits, emotional habits, physical habits that we learn at an early age. And there's 9 basic ones. So the basic idea is that there's 3 types of 3 ways that we lean on one of what we call the 3 centers of intelligence. There's the head, the intellect, the heart, the emotional intelligence, right? And also body intelligence. The body and our instincts can be very, very intelligent, know what to do, and can be quite creative. And you see that with, animals, our fellow creatures. So there's 3 centers of intelligence, and we tend to lean on one of the 3, and we can all kind of verify this in our experience. We know people, maybe ourselves. I'm a person like this who are very heady. They're mental types. They have to constantly be. They're very much living in their heads and have very active minds. Right? They're kind of blessed with, minds that can abstract things or think of constant new possibilities, or can constantly be anticipating what might happen, right? What might happen wrong, usually, with our minds. Or can accumulate vast information about all kinds of things. That's 3 of the types. I just named 3 of the types there that you see on the Enneagram, 5, 6, and 7. Those are the head types, the mental types. But we also know people who have, they lean heavily on being very emotionally intelligent. I don't know if any of you remember All in the Family from way back in the 1970s, but that Edith Bunker, if you remember that character, she came across as being, not all that, intellectually gifted, we could say, but she discovered at one point in the series that she had another kind of intelligence that Archie and others, her husband Archie and others, most certainly didn't have, and that's emotional intelligence, something that Dan Goleman has written about, and it's something everyone has and can develop. But some people are particularly talented at tuning into other people, sensing emotions, intuiting where other people are at, being good at connecting with others, and working with other people when emotion is a factor in a situation, right? That's the second kind of three types um, that you see here. The type 2, 3, and 4. Those are the what we call the heart types. People who are really kind of gifted at working with emotions, with feeling, the level of feeling. And it might be, artistic. It might be about working with other people. It might be, really good at reading what other people need and then acting on it, doing it well based upon what you sense other people want or need, right? So then there's the last of the three types you see at the top here, 8, 9, and 1. Those are the body types or the instinctive types. So I think people who, for example, are very gifted with their bodies, athletes or musicians, um, or people who are very good with their hands, people who know to just pick things up. Like, some people learn a musical instrument. When I learn something new, like a musical instrument, I have to read up on it, figure out, when I'm going to cook something, I stick to the recipe, like my wife would say, and make sure, I'm following that recipe. Whereas other people simply just start working with the ingredients, or they pick up a musical instrument and they learn to play it fairly quickly just by playing with it, messing around with it. Those are body types. They have a natural proclivity for bodily creativity and intelligence. I think of Michael Jordan or some, you know, LeBron James, people who are they just seem to be able to be creative in the moment with how they're moving around the basketball court. Right? So the Enneagram posits that we depend on one of these three types. But there's three variations of those three. There's people who tend to be mental, people who tend to lean on their emotional sense of things, and people who um, are more or less gifted physically and in their instinctive sense of things. But there's three variations on those three, hence 9 types, 3 times 3. And where that comes from, interestingly enough, is, well, basically in Buddhism, there's a typology. So you've probably, if you've listened to other talks about Buddhism, you're familiar with the 3 toxins or the 3 poisons: greed, hatred, delusion, or greed, aversion, and delusion, that the Buddha talked about, that we have to become free of in order to become free of dukkha, and suffering. And just intuitively, we know that, right? Greed causes a lot of problems. Hatred or aversion causes a lot of problems. And just being deluded, having a lot of strong opinions that don't necessarily apply in every situation, that can be a problem. So in Buddhism, not the Buddha, but a bit later, another Buddhist master said, he noticed there's basically 3 types of people who tend to be more like greed types, craving types. They go for all the gusto, but they do it through one of the three centers, with their bodies, with their minds, or with their feelings. And the psychologist Karen Horney noticed this with her patients, and this has been tested psychologically that there's three types. There are you could say the greed types, which are the or grasping types, craving types. She noticed that, and this has been noticed with infants even, that they move against, and if they're faced with conflict or difficulty, they tend to be aggressive. They tend to assert their ego, their sense of a separate self. And again, they either do it mentally, like the type 7's a head type, so they tend to do that mentally. Type 8 up there is a body type, so they tend to be like physically aggressive, right? At least certainly as little children. And then there's the type 3, that they're the heart types. They tend to project their emotional intelligence outward. They tend not to pay attention to their own emotional needs, but they're tuned into the needs of others. And it tends to be very practical, they tend to be very performance oriented based upon what they sense other people need or want from them. But they project an image of success, right? So that's one type. Then in Buddhism, they also talk about the aversive types. Not necessarily hatred's kind of a little bit too strong, but people who tend. Karen Horney, the psychologist, said that it's people who tend to, when they're faced with conflict, they tend to withdraw. They go into their turtle shell. Another way to look at this is fight, flight, or freeze. So there's the fight, the craving, the assertive types. Then there's the withdrawal types, or the flight types. They withdraw. They try to get the heck out of there. So we have head types that withdraw, type 5 that withdraw into their inner sanctum of their minds. I think of Mr. Spock on Star Trek, very heady, very intellectual, really take great pride in what and how much they know. And everything is very filtered through what all the knowledge and information they've accumulated. It all gets filtered through that. But actually what they're trying to do is stay safe by hiding out in their intellectual sanctuary, But there's emotional withdrawal types, type 4. They withdraw into their feeling, into their sense of the tragic, the dark. They're very comfortable with dark feelings. They tend to feel like they're special, and their sense of being separate is very poignant and very emotional, often very dramatic, and have a tragic view of life, right? And how they fit in with everyone else that tends to be seen through a tragic lens. And then the third type of withdrawal type is a body-based withdrawal type. So that's the type 9. They tend to one of the great teachers of the Enneagram, Claudio Naranjo, called it narcotize. He was a psychiatrist, so he would use psychiatric terms. They tend to withdraw. They use their bodies to avoid conflict at all cost, right? By withdrawing into the capacity of the body to just numb out, right? So that's the body way of withdrawing. So then the third variation of the three types of body, heart, and mind and head is the freeze response, or what Karen Horney would call the compliant, or the moving with, the compliant types. So they tend to want to, they're the freeze types. They tend to want to, work with whatever they perceive as causing the conflict. If somebody's coming at them, rather than fight them or try to escape, they try to charm them or, engage them, right? Those are the compliant types in the Buddhist terminology, you could call them the deluded types, deluded, not diluted. In other words, have a they try to project an image of compliance with whatever the threat is. So those that do that emotionally, the um, type two, they are they're that's the archetype of being the helper, wanting to be helpful, uh, pinning all your hopes on certain special people that you really want to. Your whole identity and your whole image of yourself is wrapped up on, I can help you. I know I can help you. I'm going to help you. Like nurses or teachers or ministers. Often that's kind of the archetypal profession of the helping type, right? So they're using their heart, their emotional intelligence to um, basically hope to get other people to be dependent on them helping them, right? Um, Whereas the head type, compliant type 6 over here, is um, they tend to lean on their mental capacity, but their core issue is around authority, around wanting to do the right thing in a situation, right? And they think, because of the separation, they think they're separate. They think they have to find that authority outside of themselves. They're trying to comply with an external authority, and they're always being disappointed. So they tend to be skeptical too. Both very trusting and then skeptical when the people that they put their confidence in as authorities fail them. Right? And then the third variation on these deluded freeze compliant types is type 1. They're a body type, so they have a bodily instinctual sense of this is right, that's wrong. What they're compliant with is their inner sense of their inner critic, which is they're so identified with their inner judge and their inner critic that they don't even see it. And they're going around, and their inner critic is constantly filtering everything they see and do. They have a sense of right and wrong, black and white, justice and injustice, and it's instinctual. It's a bodily felt sense of compliance. They're complying with their inner sense of right and wrong that they're heavily identified with. So anyway, that's a quick tour of the Enneagram and the 9 Enneatypes, based upon these 3 types of 3 that are based in psychology, based even in Buddhist tradition, and based on this notion of 3 centers of intelligence that Gurdjieff was the first one to really, you see examples of this throughout history, but Gurdjieff really was the first person to really talk about the 3 brains, so head, heart, and gut, and that's been very validated, by modern psychology and brain science. So, so why is mindfulness so powerful when combined with this study and use of the Enneagram? So the Enneagram is, as I said, is powerful not only because it can help diagnose your blind spots, the fact that the problem is that, and the reason dukkha is so heavily, and our conditioning is so heavily embedded around these 9 archetypes, is they're what Gurdjieff called our chief feature. They're something that it's kind of a set of core assumptions about ourselves and feelings about ourselves as a separate self, and kind of our felt kinesthetic felt sense. And it's so unconscious. It's such a core part of our identity, who we think we are, and how we think we need to be to survive in the world, that we don't even see it. Other people often kind of who have to work with us or live with us might have a sense of how we are as one of these 9 types, these 9 styles of dukkha, you know. But we don't see it. We're so identified with it. It's like back here, you know. It's like who we think we are. We don't even know that we tend to gravitate to that particular style of dukkha. So that's why the Enneagram is very powerful, because it can be a diagnostic tool to help you see, zoom in on which of those 9 archetypes you are. You know, which of the 3 centers of intelligence do I tend to lean on? And what's that temperament or style of applying that way of leaning on that, like we were just talking about. So in order to see that, and the Enneagram not only shows as a diagnosis, but shows us the path forward. It gives us particular. Also, there's different layers of the Enneagram. There's the Enneagram of what we call the ego fixations, so the ones I've been talking about. But there's also an Enneagram of virtues, right? There's kind of 9 emotion ways of feeling, of awakened feeling, that are particular to each of the 9 types. They're kind of the antidote to those 9 ways of suffering, of dukkha. And there's also 9 right views. You know, in Buddhism, in the beginning of the Eightfold Path, we talk about right view, you know, having a clarity of how you see the world, that doesn't come from this preconditioned way of, you know, stories and narratives that we believe in, but is non-dualistic. You know, the perception that, you know, I am a reflection of Buddha nature. I'm not just this separate, vulnerable little human being. I'm actually, you know, this wave on this ocean of consciousness. Right? And there's 9 views of that that correspond to the 9 ego fixations, the 9 styles of dukkha, that by contemplating those, you start to be able to awaken your higher capacities of the mind, your capacity for wisdom, for prajna, for insight, vipassana. So you could already sense, as I have been learning, I'm very excited about learning all these wonderful correspondences between the teachings of the Buddha and Buddhism and the Buddha Dharma and the teachings of the Enneagram. But what I'm really interested in is the practical side of this. There's a practical side. There's in the basic teachings on mindfulness that the Buddha taught, he talked about the 4 foundations of mindfulness. What's practical with mindfulness that can be applied to understanding and working with the Enneagram are the first 3, the 3 core foundations of mindfulness, which are relax, be relaxed, you know, with the body, alert. This is where I started, right? Relaxed, alert, with the attention, present, being focused on what's actually happening here and now, and being aware of it, and kind, the heartfulness part. Think of what are called the Brahma Viharas, the divine abodes: compassion, loving kindness, joy, sympathetic joy, equanimity. Those are the higher feeling heart qualities. A typical way of just working with mindfulness is to work with these 3 core foundations, working with a sense of the body, the direct contact with sensation of the breath. Kind of, that's the first foundation. You kind of, when you start meditation or when you're trying to wake up in the midst of everyday life, just tune into the body, and that brings you right here. Have you noticed that? It's the first foundation of mindfulness. The second foundation is feeling, Vedana, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. You know, when I feel my body, or I hear a sound, or a thought pops into my head, it always has one of three qualities. It's pleasant, it's unpleasant, or it's neutral, in the most basic sense of feeling, right? And then the emotions that are kind of differentiations of that. They're unpleasant, they're pleasant, they're neutral, but they might be anger, they might be sadness, they might be joy, they might be, peacefulness. There's emotions, but at their core, and all living beings, all, breathing living beings experience this. They experience pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, no matter what's coming in through the sense doors or through the mind. So the first step in mindfulness meditation is contact with the body, just being in contact with our physical senses, all five of our senses, and being with the thoughts is just thoughts coming and going without believing in them. The second foundation then is feeling, Vedana, pleasant, and being mindful, learning to be with the unpleasantness, to tolerate it, to allow it to be without reacting to it. Can I kind of dance with the unpleasantness? Or if it's pleasant, can I, there's a tendency to want to grasp or crave or hold on to it. Can I be with that if it's pleasant? Or it might be that it's just neutral. It's neither pleasant nor unpleasant. We're not really paying attention at all. It's coming in through the sense doors or our mind, and it may be actually affecting us, but we don't notice it. We're tuning out to it, so it's because it's neutral. So that's the second foundation. As we're able to just simply be with the sensations, we're able to be aware and to be able to be with and to be able to allow the pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. So some of you might be familiar with RAIN, RAIN, recognize, allow, investigate, and not identify or nurture. There's two different meanings for N. So that's another way of talking about these four foundations. The first foundation is the R, to recognize, I'm being triggered. I'm having a dukkha moment here, I'm suffering. This is an opportunity to be mindful, to practice, to be with it. It begins with that recognition, the direct contact with the thought as a thought, or the sensation is just a sensation. But then this second part, being with the feeling quality, the pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, is the A in RAIN, the allow. Allow it. Can I cultivate mindfulness of it? Can I mindfully be with that quality of pleasant or unpleasant or neutral? And then the third foundation, I won't talk so much about the fourth foundation because it's a more advanced topic than we have time for today. But the third foundation is mindfulness of the mind itself. What our mind, our memories, our mental capacities, what our mind does with what's arising moment by moment, coming through the sense doors or the thoughts that are arising. What does our mind then do with that? So often if it's unpleasant, we start to avoid the unpleasantness. And so we might think about something, or we might reach a conclusion that this person's trying to saying these nasty things, and that means they're trying to harm me, right? So we tend to have some kind of top 20 tunes that we tend to play over and over again with our mental, it's called the mental formations is what we call it in Buddhism. So we can become mindful of that. And that's the I in RAIN. There's a progression with these three core foundations of mindfulness. First, we tune in, we recognize, we feel the suffering, the dukkha, the sensation, let's say. Then right away, we work with being mindful, allowing the pleasant or unpleasant and neutral, to developing our capacity just to be with that, not just react and try to, avoid the unpleasant or grasp after the pleasant or ignore the neutral. But then this third stage, if we get that far, we start to be able to explore it, to investigate, to not only be with it, to recognize it and to allow it, be with the feeling of it, but we can also work with it. We can start to bring the wisdom factor, prajna, our natural capacity to understand and to have insight starts to come online. That's the I in rain, the investigate stage. So ultimately, if we're able to cultivate those three foundations of mindfulness, and they all tend to happen in close succession, if not instantaneously, then the fourth foundation, the fourth stage of rain, of not identifying, letting go, being able to see what's happening is, most of it, the dukkha aspect of it is a creation of our conditioning. It's not really, what's really happening is not what our minds and our conditioning are making of it, right? So if we recognize, cultivate mindfulness of the sensations and the thoughts, allow ourselves to feel what we're feeling without reacting, and then we're able to investigate, to be curious, to explore it, to bring wisdom, then at some point, just very naturally, there's like a letting go. There's a seeing it for what it really is, moment by moment, and no longer as a source of suffering or dukkha. If we can see clearly and feel, with a lot of clarity, and we're able to relate, to pay attention to our conditioning that arises, RAI, then the end will happen. We don't have to do anything about it. We'll be able to see it clearly, and it will just liberate itself. It'll let go. So that's how we work with these chief features, these 9 archetypal forms of dukkha. And there's a correlation, right? In fact, these 3 ways of working with mindfulness of the body, mindfulness of feeling, mindfulness of mind. Well, what does that sound like? It sounds like those 3 centers of intelligence that, and the key to making progress with seeing and becoming free of our particular type of dukkha, or one of the 9, and just in general, the freedom from dukkha, the key is to awaken all 3 of those centers of intelligence. This is what Gurdjieff really emphasized, the guy who first started talking about the 3 centers of intelligence. He said the key to waking up, to realizing our essential Buddha nature, and for all these deeper capacities to come online, the key is to awaken the 3 centers. So, as we were saying, we have a tendency to rely too much on one center, the head, the heart, the gut. So, but we need all 3. All of us need all 3, and all of us can have all 3 come online fully, to awaken fully to our emotional intelligence, to awaken fully to what our body knows in any given situation, right? Or our instincts, our animal instincts tell us a lot, or our capacity to pay attention, to see clearly without being clouded by our conditioning, right? If we can awaken those 3 centers of intelligence and see how we're caught in depending on one of those 3, and awaken the other 2, then they can come into a beautiful right relationship to each other. It's like they're in a relationship, like we're operating on all cylinders, basically. So that's what the Buddha was trying to do with the foundations of mindfulness, what we try to do with rain, and what the Enneagram is about. The Enneagram is about seeing how we're over-dependent on one of those 3 centers and cultivating mindfulness, wakefulness, being present to, and the capacity to use the three centers in an awake, balanced way. So that's it. That's basically what I wanted to share about mindfulness in the Enneagram and how we can combine the two in very, very powerful ways to free ourselves from dukkha, from our particular way of suffering that we don't even hardly see about ourselves.